Welcome to the S2 Cognition Podcast. S2 is the official cognitive evaluation in sports, from youth to pro, where athletes and coaches build to win.
Welcome to the S2 Cognition Podcast. Today we are joined by Chapman University men's basketball head coach and host of Slappin Glass Pod, Dan Krikorian. A few weeks ago, we spent a few days out with his staff and roster in Orange County, and they are absolutely a first-class organization. Also, if you haven't listened to the Slappin Glass Podcast and you're a basketball junkie, well, I guess sicko is the cool word now to use, you're absolutely missing out. They have some awesome conversations with some of the best mind in all of basketball. A couple guys come to mind: Brad Stevens, both Van Gundy brothers, who are probably my favorite, Mike D'Antoni, Taylor Jenkins, Will Hardy, Steve Clifford, and Dusty May, and my guys, of course, Ryan Pannone, Cody Toppert, and TJ Saint. So many others I'm leaving out, but in the description, we'll actually link a URL for their website, for their newsletter that you can sign up for and be a part of, and I will also link their podcast. But today we're going to dive into the intricacies and challenges that coaches face when understanding a player's on-court decision-making. We'll also explore some pain points that coaches feel in their players' on-court decision-making and the importance of understanding player dynamics and creating synergistic rotations, which was one of my favorite discussions, is understanding that synergistic rotation based on how these players make reads and decisions, and then the need for adaptability and continuous learning in the coaching profession. For those that are new here, welcome. We're excited to have you today, and those that are returning listeners, we always appreciate your support. To help us continue our growth, we ask that you subscribe, rate, and review the show. Thanks again to Coach Krikorian for taking time to join us. We hope you enjoy. All right, Dan, you're part of one of the most successful podcasts that's out there, coaching podcast, basketball podcast, however you want to splice it up. And the list of guests you've had on is truly amazing. I listed a lot of those guys in the intro. What I've taken away from your podcast is a lot of those big hitters in the intro, they reference decision-making. What is the frequency at which coaches talk about decision-making on your podcast?
I don't know the exact number of times or percentage, but I know it's a lot, because it's kind of the name of the game, right? As a coach, is you ultimately are trying to coach, teach, lead your group into becoming better decision makers on the court, in the game, when you have, less control, really. Practice is one thing where you kind of isolate situations and whatnot, but ultimately what we're trying to get to is, can your 5 players make the best possible decision, much of the time in a game, when it matters, when there's score, all that kind of stuff. And so it comes up a lot. I think that's sort of the holy grail of coaching, right? Can we create better decision makers? And so I would say most conversations weave in and around that a lot.
And what would you describe as the biggest pain points that you hear, right? So the coaches talk about decision making. Okay, what are the pain points that you get the most?
So one of the things I think that coaches think about a lot is the relationship between skill, decision making, and certain times you have a player that's for the terms of this conversation, like skilled. They can shoot it, they can pass it on air. You watch them do dribbling, ball handling drills, and it looks great. So they're skilled, but then when it gets to where there's defenders and all these things in front of them and decisions have to be made, can that skill translate into better decisions, or the right decisions, or an array of right decisions? And I think that that gets talked about all the time, because trying to get that transfer over of, yes, they can shoot, pass, and dribble when no one's watching or there's no defenders, but then when you start adding movement and all the variables, how do you do that in a coordinated fashion? I think is something that we're all thinking about and trying to train better, think about better, and use analytics, use film, use all the things that I know we're going to get into today. But it's like I mentioned, the holy grail of coaching. I think it's something I think about personally all the time.
When you hear them talk about those pain points, and then as a coach yourself, what are your personal pain points. Like when you hear them describe certain pain points, hey, right, it's a lofty term. It's a very umbrella term, decision-making. Scott and I talk about this all the time, Brandon as well on the podcast. Decision-making is such a broad term that the hope is to identify individual areas. Like, what do you mean decision maker? If I asked your definition of decision-making, someone else's, they're totally different. What are your personal coaching pain points in decision-making when it comes to players on the court?
Yeah, I think that decision-making for basketball is so layered because your decision is contingent on what your teammate just made a decision on, whether they pass, shot it, dribbled it or not. And so you have to react to their decision. It's not just in isolation. So I think about that all the time is coordinated decision-making amongst a group rather than just one person making the decision. Sometimes the one person making a decision is the ultimate, like, okay, pass or shoot, they're able to score or whatever it is. But for me, the pain points or the things I think about is the coordinated effort of a group and getting 5 players to make decisions off of each other's movements, off of each other's shot, pass, drive. And then I go back to then, what does that look like as a scheme? How do I put them in positions as a coach to make those things a little bit easier? So I think the pain points for me have personally been the transfer over. I've been at the college level now for 12 years. I was high school level for 4 years. I was a player for 4 years in college. So, now over 20 years of, I guess, high school to college basketball. And how do you train smartly so that it actually makes sense in a game when it really matters and not just on air, I think is something I think about a lot.
Yeah, we hear that term square peg, round hole, but what does it actually mean? And how are coaches, like, you hear it and it sounds great and like that's what we're going to train, but we know that that's always not the case, right? It sounds great, but how do you actually make the square peg fit in the square hole, right? And the decision making is just one element of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll say too, for basketball, especially with it being such a fluid game, there's not stops and starts as much as some other sports where you can kind of recalibrate your thoughts. And as a coach, calling a play, and, football, you stop in between each play. Other sports, you stop. Basketball, unless there's a timeout or free throw, it's continuous, right? So like there's parts of basketball that are much different where the decision-making, how fast your brain is processing, like you don't have time to take a break between bad decision, I should have made a pass and I shot it, and really think about that too much, because you have to transition to defense and you have to find your matchup. And then all of a sudden here comes a pick and roll. And then all of a sudden you're in the tag and then it goes the other. So that's the fun part about basketball. Why I love it is because it's constant and there are no breaks really.
Yeah, I think that got exacerbated in the FIBA game, right? If you watched Olympics, we're always used to watching the NBA and there's a bunch of commercials and coaching timeouts and TV timeouts, and they've got to get their commercials in for the viewer. And the FIBA is such a, hey, we only have a few timeouts. The game's only stopped a few times. And I looked up a couple times and I'm like, it's been 10 minutes of game time and no one has stopped play at all. And so, games like in FIBA games, you're like, man, you better have good, quote unquote, decision makers out there that can find that isolation, that can get into those good high pick and roll reads. So I think the FIBA and Olympics was a nice reminder of that, just from a, wow, okay, the less you stop the game, the better those players better be at those decision-making capabilities.
100%. And to just wrap up to kind of the quickness of decisions and things we were talking about, I think one of the things that's always intrigued me as a coach is the correlation between what a player can do. So going back to pass, dribble, shoot, can they actually handle the ball? Can they actually shoot it at a high enough clip? And then what do they see? Like, do they see it? Do they see the help? Do they see the play in front of them? And then do they actually decide to do it? Like, and some players can physically see it and then for a variety of reasons don't do it. Or they can physically pass and shoot, but they have trouble seeing it. So then the doing becomes harder. So I think this is something that I know we'll probably get into, but that relationship is different for each player. And I think it's fascinating. And I think it's something that, I've spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, I think you're getting at the crux of the problem. When we say decision making, we all know what it is, but it's it's a really high level, broad term. And you kind of alluded to some of the issues with thinking about decision making. Some of it has to do with how you're processing what you see. Did you see that guy cut? Did you see the intentions of your teammate, movement, motion? Are you able to see multiple bodies moving at the same time? Did you see the defender lean this way or that way? All of the ways that an athlete is processing the visual environment is one or contributes to decisions that are made. But it's not just what you see. You've got to connect, like you talked about, what you see to what you do. And so you've got to translate. You may see it, but not do anything about it. Or what you decide to do about it is the wrong action based on what you saw. So there's action control. There's not biting on impulses to fall prey to the juke, the fake, the pump. There's action control systems. That is where we have felt that there's an important aspect of decision making where we start breaking down the unique pieces of decision making so that athletes can understand what aspects of decision making do you do well and what aspects are you perhaps less consistent, might get you in trouble at times. How has understanding a little bit more about the nuances and the components of decision making helped you, and as you're starting to think about understanding decision making for your players?
Yeah, I think so. The more I get into this and think about it, and like I said, I'm no expert at all, but I think that time is such a huge element to all this. The right decision at the wrong time doesn't really help you either. Or if you take too much time to make a decision, it still doesn't help you on the basketball court. The time. So trying to also not even just see it, do it, but like, when does it actually happen is something thinking a lot about. And I think that, of course, the more guys you have on your team, guys or girls you have on your team that are better decision makers, and then you group them together, the hope is that you have this group that just plays in synergy together and is able to bounce back from, I mean, let's be honest, you're not always going to make the right decision in a basketball game. You're just not. And so being able to kind of move on and get to the next thing, I think is something we think about a lot. But what my feeling of all this is how do I help our players make these decisions on time, right? So like the right pass, the extra pass on time, because that's going to lead to a higher percentage shot, the drive versus the kick, all those things. And some players have a harder time doing it on time. I think it's going back to seeing it, doing it, understanding it. They might see it, but then for whatever reason, they don't do it exactly when the play's there. And then all of a sudden the play moves on and now, we're 2 steps behind type of deal. So and then also too, I think this is just another interesting part. I think about it for coaching, decision making for coaching, and split second impulse decisions on substitutions, timeouts, play calls. There's a million things going on in the middle of a game that's going on in our heads too. And so it's, I love it. I know we're talking about our players, but also like for myself, for our staff, how our brains are processing the information in real time during a game is interesting as well. And I'm, like I said, by no means am I an expert, but I'm interested in it for sure.
That's a great transition right to what Scott was talking about. All right, so we a couple weeks ago we came out, tested your players, just a couple quick hitters, biggest takeaways that Scott can just really break down from a coaching perspective. Once you got your players tested, just lay out some of those takeaways.
Well, it was fascinating. I mean, still going through all the results, and we're going to be sitting down with our players individually here next week and going through them. They're fascinated too. Our players are pumped to see how they did or did not do on some of these things. But I'll say this, like, it's been a valuable source of information for us about how our players process information. And I think as a coach, you can't control everything, but you're trying to get as much data as you possibly can about your team and the game and the systems you run, all those kinds of things. And I think that I was talking to some other coaches about this past weekend, And what it means to me and what we're trying to do with it is it's like another data point about our players that we didn't have before. So you've got analytics, that you talk about all the stuff that happens on the court that you can track. You have other things, each program a little bit different, that you might track or that you might know about your players personally, all those things. This is like another set of data points that I think will help educate our staff, myself, on, why maybe a player is struggling in a certain area. And you look at, their scores and maybe their decision processing or maybe their court vision is a little bit less than others. And it's going to allow me, I think, to put together player development plans that specifically for that player help target both their strengths and their weaknesses, because I think doubling down on some of the strengths that we've found out about our players is going to be beneficial. Some players have high decision complexity. They can play an on ball and they have spatial awareness, and it makes sense. Maybe some of our point guards, you can give them more complicated actions on the court and in their player development processes, versus others that don't have that, but they have other skill sets that can fit with the team and still help us win. And so how do you take those scores, put them in a player development plan? And then I'll go one step further, us thinking about our system and our schemes and playing players together that complement each other from some of the standpoints that were tested. So, being able to put 5 guys together that have great spatial awareness and decision complexity and all that execution control, the stuff that you all tested, you should have a team that's not bad, right? You should be able to have a team that can flow. And so and though it won't be the end all be all, because some players are athletically gifted and maybe not as gifted in some of the stuff that you tested. And so they're going to be on the court. But I think it gives us another set of data points to train, to scheme, and to ultimately help our players become, the best versions of themselves.
Decision making, right? It when a player makes a poor decision. You can see it, you can observe it. And if they're consistently making a poor decision, but you don't know why, it's not enough to say, can this player make decisions or not? Every player's making decisions. And as you so nicely described, they're making constant decisions. It's so dynamic and so relentless in terms of every moment. You've got to decide what you're paying attention to, what you're going to do, and you got to react and control your reactions. And it's just relentless. Understanding why someone is making certain kinds of mistakes in their decision making, the source is critical as a critical first step for understanding what we're going to do about it. What are they seeing or not seeing? What are they understanding or not able to understand at game speed? What are their vulnerabilities and how they react to split-second situations that happen unexpectedly? Until you kind of understand the building blocks of their decision-making system, you're kind of guessing, aren't you?
Yeah, I would say what you all tested, some of it was things that made sense to me and our staff, because a senior, you go, okay, that makes sense based off of the 4 years with us and how they play. Some of the scores you're going, okay. But our freshmen, they just got to campus. This is invaluable, because now as you start to build out for the future, having, a template of, how their brains work, how they're potentially going to fit into certain things that we're going to do. I go back to time. We were talking about time earlier. The time saved, I think, for us, or at least having those things earlier in the process, helps, I think, hopefully helps if we do our jobs correctly. We'll see, that remains to be seen. But if we hopefully do our jobs well, it can help them quicker in the process. And so, it was great for us and for me now to sit and look at a senior who coached through a lot of games, look at their scores, and there's still some surprises. Trust me, there's still some surprises, but certain things they did well, you go, okay, that makes sense because I've seen them over and over do that. Versus some of the players that haven't had a lot of court time, able to look at, okay, this is interesting. How is this going to translate? Or looking at, hey, we have a senior who's also high in this score, and we have a freshman that's high in this score. That maybe bodes well for that freshman in our program because we have, someone who's had a lot of court time in this same vein. So tons and tons of interesting stuff. Like we could do 2 hours on just our team and all the stuff I've learned, but that would only be interesting to maybe me, not your whole audience.
I don't believe that. But I do want to touch on something you talked about earlier, or at least referenced. This idea of like synergistic rotations based on decision making, right? So we hear and I don't want to steal your example, but like the flow of the game, and they're in the flow, and they always seem to be cutting off, and they're doing the right decision based on this and the read. And they all know each other so well. It's interesting, right? So hearing, if you want to stay in flow and just have a bunch of guys making the right read and decision, wouldn't you think, man, great spatial awareness and great decision complexity, those two players linking them up, or those two processes, linking those up with all 5, players on the court, you should be able to play in flow. What were some of those, I guess, recognizing, or without giving up too many secrets, you were talking about, synergistic rotations. Can you dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah. And so for those maybe listening that are basketball folks, I'll give a basketball example about what I'm thinking about with some of the results, our players and things like that. So let's just talk about like pick and roll play for a second. Some of the things I think I looked at and am thinking about are there's certain players that in the scoring didn't test as high in spatial awareness and decision complexity and even in improvisation, but they're elite scorers or they can play in space. And so like when you talk about a pick and roll, those are players that are maybe lower in those things that to me, it would make more sense to have anytime they're in a pick and roll. And this is a basketball term, excuse me, but those players that are setting the screen for them just need to slip out and give them space. They don't need to stay and set the screen and turn it. And we have a bunch of tags and a bunch of things. Just slip out, create a space, because those ball handlers who are maybe a little bit lower in some of those things, they just need more space to operate because they're skilled enough to make the play, but they're not like some of our other players who are high in decision complexity, high in improvisation, high in some of the other scores that, they could play in a tighter window. They understand, they feel what's going on. So maybe we can actually set the screen or twist the screen, or the player goes under and we reset the screen and we give a little more space because they process that faster versus others like, just get the heck out. Just create a gap. Let that player get to the rim. That's how they process. So I'm thinking about those things a little bit more. Like when you talk about now getting to a scheme and how you're going to play offensively, our players are going to know, hey, here's certain players that can probably play a little bit more in on balls versus others playing through slips or through handoffs because that's just how they process better. And to me, then what it goes to the next step is it allows someone who's maybe a little lower in some things still to make the right ultimate decision because they have less going on in front of them that is going to potentially make it harder for them. So at the end of the day, let's just say you want to come off of an on-ball screen, create help, and get a kick out 3. For one player who's super high in all the processing, they might be able to sit in that on-ball and twist and turn and then see it and boom, make that pass on a dime. Versus the other player doesn't need it, but you slip out of it, they can still see the tag, they can still make the play. And so you get the same decision just through different ways is how I'm thinking about it. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
That's great. Do you envision your preferences to bring athletes in that fit your system? Or do you like kind of the challenge of learning something about unique athletes? I mean, you're always picking athletes that you like for different reasons, but do you like the challenge of learning their unique style and having to adapt your system a little bit to fit what you've got? We hear this from different coaches. Some coaches, they like the system players, and so they're looking for very specific characteristics. And decision making is going to be part of that formula. It's becoming part of that formula. Or do you like we've had some coaches say, no, I like to adapt my system based on what I get. If I get some basic, boxes checked in terms of their athleticism, their physical characteristics, but I like the uniqueness and the diversity of the player characteristics at some level because it forces me to be creative, adapt, and adjust. So I'm just not a stagnant system. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I agree. I like good players, like every coach. So we'll start there. So no matter how they look, it helps you win for sure. I think that you're 100% correct, and sort of where I like to be is in the, we have a way that we like or prefer to play, but that's different every year based off of who's in our, say, top 8 to 10. That's different almost every. Yeah, and that's different every game too, based off what the defense might do or our opponent. Like, so to your point, I love that process of figuring out who does what well, how they work together. You have, like, as we're recording this, it's kind of preseason, getting ready for practice. You've sat all spring and summer and you have all these great ideas of what you might do. And then all of a sudden you get to the court, maybe it doesn't really work, or these 5 players together you thought were going to be great, but you know what? Actually, there's another player that works. I love that. And I go back to some of the stuff you've all helped provide. Like, I think it makes me even more excited to tinker with those things, because I think the truly great coaches that I'll go back to, like, had on the podcast or I've been fortunate to know, be friends with, they're unbelievable tinkers. They're always tinkering. They're always adjusting, right? They have a system, but the system is flexible enough to take into account what their players do ultimately well to win.
Yeah. And Scott, that's probably because he's got great instinctive learning. Okay. So that's not fair for those of us who don't have good instinctive learning. But to your point, Dan, like, I was listening to the Stan Van Gundy episode whenever that came out. I listened to it, and he's talking about we play inside to out. Now, how that looks like when I had Dwight Howard is very different than when I had Dwayne Wade, but both get the ball in and then we play out. Now, it might look differently to both, but the principle is still the same. And that's what I love about that. Probably a great tinkerer, Stan Van Gundy, huh?
Oh, well, yeah, the ultimate. They're the best. Both him and Jeff, for sure.
I like that what you said, the cognitive characteristics of your players. Now that you've got this at your fingertips, now that you're getting a little more insight, it's another variable. It's another consideration in how you develop, how you're going to structure, tinker your offense. I mean, that's a cool concept. I mean, that's how we looked at it. It's just a piece of the puzzle. Being a great athlete or great coach is so multifactorial. This is just one new kind of additional piece to the puzzle. Coaches have always appreciated decision making is such a fundamental part of success and athletic performance. But now that we can quantify it, you're right. It gives you another volume control knob to tinker with. Another switch on your soundboard. I know you'll like that example, because I just learned that you're this incredible musician. We're going to have to send some props. So you're going to tell us more about where folks can find the great stuff like Coach Dan Krikorian.
So thank you for that, though. Thanks for the plug.
No, okay. So before we move into the last piece of the podcast, which is just our 3 random funny questions that could be neither, they could be both, it could be one or the other. Do you have anything to plug? And I'm going to be plugging Slappin Glass, so don't you worry. I did put in the intro, we're going to put, like, if you want to join their newsletter, we're going to drop it in the description box. We're going to put the podcast link to the Apple Podcast in the description as well. But go ahead. If there's anything you want to plug, Chapman University, go ahead. Hands are out. Let's go.
Well, yeah, definitely looking forward to the season here at Chapman University. Thanks for all the stuff with Slappin Glass. And then I don't have anything else to plug other than you all. I think that keep this or don't keep this, but I think what y'all do is amazing, and obviously I'm all in on it and excited to see where it takes us, because I think it's the next frontier of the game. The game is the game is the game. There's tons of great ways to coach, and this one thing going back to the podcast Pat and I always talk about, co-hosts for the podcast, is there's so many great coaches, so many ways to do this. And what I like is, a lot of the coaches I've talked to at different levels, kind of the stuff that you're doing is a new frontier, at least to us, maybe not to you all, but to us, that I think can help move the needle to ultimately help our players. And I think that that's what's fun for me and why I love talking to you all. I think I joked, like, I could talk about this stuff for obviously I could talk about this stuff for a long time. So I'm going to plug you all. Don't cut this. Keep it in.
Hey, I've got one more question. How has being a world-class musician impacted, or how does it influence your coaching? There's got to be some parallels there and some crossover impact. How would you say that that world, that experience, those skills, the grind has prepared you for coaching or impacted your coaching?
It's a great question. And yeah, for those listening, so I'm lucky to also have another career that I've released 7 albums and have toured, and I've have had a band for a long time, and it has helped me as a coach immeasurably. I can't state enough how much being a musician, just the act of creating, helps me on the court. And though on its face, they look very different. You know, you see people that see me with my band and up on stage and whatever, a lot different than if you come to a Chapman basketball game, or honestly a lot different than if you hear me on the podcast with Slappin Glass. To me, they're very, very, very similar. They just are different outcomes. I think through music, one thing I've learned and that I appreciate is like just not fearing failure. Because when you're a young 21, 22-year-old, I'm not someone that was ever on stage. I didn't take music lessons. I wasn't a musician growing up. I took an intro to guitar class in college to impress a girl across the hallway from me. And I just kind of went from there with it. And to get in front of people and sing and kind of your own songs, that was something that I think for me, personally was great as far as like, just try things, just go through the hard parts. I traveled all over the world, and, you know, I played in bars in front of 2 people. I was one of them. The bartender was the other. So like I've also been fortunate to play in front of, I've played in front of big show. Like I've done it all over the place. And I think that those things have taught me a lot about in coaching too. You got to be unafraid to just go for it, and you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to go undefeated every season. You're not going to make every right decision. You're not going to have all the right calls. But it's like what you do next. And then I think the final piece, and I'll close it though, is the creativity part of it is something that I really love. So when you're in a studio, when we're with your band, and you come in and you say, hey, I've got this sketch of a song and it's going to go this chord progression. And then you work with the drummer and the bass and saying, you know what, hey, a little bluesier rather than a little more rock. Hey, a little too much here, a little too much there. It's just like basketball. You have an idea for a set or how you want to play, and then you get in there and you get on the court and you're tinkering. And it's like, it didn't quite work. Let's switch that. And instead of doing that screen, let's maybe do this screen or whatever. Yeah. And so my brain kind of works the same in both instances. One, I'm just, singing on a stage. The other one, I'm, I don't know, on the bench trying to bury my head somewhere, because coaching's a lot more stressful. I'll say that.
Have you ever performed the national anthem and then turned around and coached?
No, I've been asked. I haven't done that. I've sang the national anthem before, but I haven't then coached. So maybe down the line, if someone at a Chapman basketball game, I guess if someone doesn't sing the national anthem, I could always fill in.
It's like, hey, don't worry, we got to fill in, and it's me. I can do it, and then I'm going to go coach. Man,
it's a hard song to sing.
You're going to get 2 extra bonus questions. And then Scott came up with this. What's the point of me even asking these questions? So the very first random funny question is, what is the most embarrassing thing you've ever done as a coach? And you can thank Scott. He's killing it with these questions.
The most embarrassing thing I've done. Wow. I mean, I've definitely tripped in practice multiple times. I got some new shoes last year that I was going to show them how to close out, and I closed out and face planted. So that was, that's happened a bunch. So I'll say that for sure. You've had, as you're getting your coaching voice too early in the season, you get tons of where your voice cracks in the middle of the gym, and that's the funniest thing any 18 to 22-year-old guy can hear is his voice cracking in the gym. So I've had that too.
To Doc Rivers, right? Like the Doc, like, I'm just talking like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Second question. What would you say is the most embarrassing thing an opposing coach has ever done that you've seen?
Boy, I don't want to call anybody out. So I've seen some coaches though definitely lose their minds on the sideline that I'm sure they would love to have that back. And I get it. I'm not blaming. I know the feeling, but I think you're in this business long enough. You see opposing coaches, do whatever. And I'm sure the next morning they wish it didn't happen, but that's part of the game too. That happens. Kind of a cop-out answer, but I'll give you that.
I went to grad school at Indiana University, and so I was there when Bobby Knight was there. It got some fun memories there. Yeah,
no doubt.
So insert anything Bob Knight did into that. Is that just kidding? And then the last and final question we'll ask for this segment is you've interviewed now a bunch of coaches, man. Is there any that you can take us back to, like that first time you got there and you're like, oh, I cannot believe that I'm about to interview fill in the blank, like that nervous, those butterflies, like I can't believe we're here. Who was that for you?
Yeah, great question, because there was like 12 that just popped into my head automatically that I still get nervous, Pat and I take it really seriously. And anytime we get a coach on, you want it to go well. You want them to feel comfortable. And so it's not something that I don't think will go away. I will say, so I'll give a plug to Ryan Pannone, who I know you've had on the show. He was one of the early guests on our show. And I didn't know Ryan at the time. And he was really gracious to come on when we were, just starting out. And that was great to have him on. And he kind of was great in introducing us some other coaches. There was another coach from Spain, Moncho Fernandez is his name, a coach that I'd watched his team play, highly respected his teams, and he agreed to come on, and it was like maybe 5 or 6 in the morning for me because of the time difference. So I was up early, nervous for Moncho, and then I think the other one just pops in my mind is when Brad Stevens came on the first time, and he's been a coaching hero of mine. And to actually have him pop up on the other side of the Zoom link was pretty incredible. And to go through that. So there's many, many, many others, but those, especially in the first few months of the show, were pretty fun.
Dan Krikorian, head basketball coach for Chapman University and host of Slappin Glass Pod. Thanks so much, man, for joining us. We appreciate your time and an awesome listen. We learned so much, and it's really cool how you dove into realistic examples for coaches and even maybe giving them some new ideas. So thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thanks for listening to the S2 Cognition Podcast. If you like the content we're putting out, please subscribe with that plus sign at the top of your app, leave a review about the episode, and share it with a few friends. You can follow us on Twitter at S2 Cognition and Instagram at S2.cognition. If you'd like to get in touch with the program or show, please visit our website at s2cognition.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening to the S2 Cognition Podcast. I'm your host, Harrison Hunter, signing off for now. We will talk to you soon.